Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me is noted historian and military strategist Edward Luttwak. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. So, I wanted to speak to you specifically about how technology is changing the state of warfare currently. We seem to be in this interesting time where a handful of new technologies, particularly AI as well as drones, but some other things as well, are changing the dynamics of warfare. And historically, this has been either in favor of offensive or defensive strategies. And so I was hoping to speak to you a little bit today about some recent geopolitical conflicts that have shed light on the way that technology is changing things, as well as your opinion on what these technologies might do and also their relationship to the balance of power among global powers. So I think the appropriate place to start here is with the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, which may soon be over depending on moves that are made by the Trump administration. And so to start, I'll ask you, what do you see resulting from the outcomes of this conflict, and how have you seen the dynamics of the battlefield change as a result of new technologies?
Well, the context of this war,
Hmm.
this is not a 20th century type war. This is an 18th century type war because Russia did not Putin did not declare war. He did not mobilize the armed forces, and he tried to fight with assorted mercenaries,
Hmm.
which is an 18th century thing to do. Also, he refrained from using the full power of the Soviet Union. First of all, he took nuclear weapons right off the table.
Hmm.
That is also an 18th century thing, limited wars.
Hmm.
Now, what people liked limited wars in the 20th century, which wars ended with the burning out of the offending capitals, Berlin and Tokyo and so on. But in reality, they forgot that 18th century wars were very slow and never ended. The Seven Years' War was not the longest war of the 18th century, which is the wars. So, first, limited war on the Russian side, limited war on the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian government has made no effort to bring back its citizens that escaped instead of serving the armed forces. In
Hmm.
fact, they walk into consulates and renew their passports, Ukrainian passports. Even certain governments like the Germans helpfully identified 212,000 or whatever the number was of Ukrainians of military age that were domiciled in Germany and more or less offered to expel them. And Ukraine did nothing. The age of conscription until a few months ago was 27. Nobody in history has ever conscripted soldiers at 27. 27 people have wives and even businesses and work. Then they shifted just recently to 25, which is still not an age anybody's ever conscripted. So Ukrainians' commitment to this war has always been limited. Ukrainians overseas, there are huge numbers of Ukrainians overseas who don't feel any need to go home
Hmm.
and defend their country. Unlike the Israelis on October 8, who flew out from New York and Los Angeles and Tokyo and Venice to rush to fight for their country, the Ukrainians haven't. So it's been a limited war.
Hmm.
It's a limited war, and in this limited war, you've had a very slow and partial use of technology, of the new technology and so on. For example, even these anti-missile devices that you now put on top of a tank to protect it from anti-tank missiles. The Germans sent some Leopards. They didn't bother to put these devices on. The Leopards were shot. And a lot, in other words, this is a 18th century type war in which a lot of the things that you see are modified and so on. I mean, it's a dramatic fact that Putin is still not declared war. And therefore, he was not able to mobilize the armed forces, not able to deploy a single constituted formation of the Russian army, because they all contain a quota of conscripts.
Mm.
So everything should be. Now, there was, of course, the use of uh, no new equipment at all has been used in this war, except for uh, very sort of not categories of equipment, but for example, it was a tryout for the U.S. Javelin anti-tank missile,
Hmm.
which is an interesting anti-tank missile because the logic of anti-tank weapons is that they're so cheap.
Right.
And therefore, you can have so many of them that they can be distributed on the battlefield and therefore don't need mobility, don't need protection. The anti-tank missile doesn't need an armored carapace,
Hmm.
and it doesn't need mobility because they're so cheap. They're everywhere. Except the Javelin was not cheap. It was
Right.
$900,000,
Hmm.
which is not far from the cost of a tank. So, as I say, the lessons of Ukraine have to be put through all of these different filters, uh, and therefore they're extremely limited. Yes, drones. Yes. So in 1982, Israel invaded into southern Lebanon with and had organic drones in its armored brigades.
Hmm.
Okay, that's 1982. That's 40 years ago. So with a mere delay of 40 years, drones were used in operationally and so on. So we actually, so the Ukraine war is not really a modern war at all. It's an 18th century war fought lackadaisically with mercenaries, which lasts forever, and in which neither side fully commits at all. Now, the small war, the very tiny war that was compared to Ukraine, of course, it was the war between Israel and Hezbollah was a different thing altogether, because in that war, what you saw was the full use of artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
the full use of all the telecommunication technologies, the full use of the intercept technologies and the penetration technologies to be able to go into the heart of an armed force like Hezbollah, which is a light infantry armed force. It doesn't have artillery really,
Yeah.
but it has lots of rockets and missiles. And what happened was that there wasn't a fight between this Hezbollah force with 100,000 rockets and maybe 20,000 missiles and the Israelis. No, instead, what happened was that the Israelis used today's technology to penetrate right into the heart of Hezbollah, neutralize it, shut down its command system, force them to gather in a single place, and then use some tactical ingenuity to destroy their bomb-proof command center, thereby decapitating the entire organization.
Hmm.
It is the equivalent of the United States fighting somebody or other, and the Pentagon gets blown away. Now, and everybody in it
Hmm.
gets destroyed. And then what happens? Yes, well, there are many things that happens, but perfect coordination is not going to be one of them. And transmission of intelligence, etc., etc. So the new war, the modern war that one should learn something from is the Israel-Hezbollah war.
Hmm.
Even though it was because this is what you are supposed to be doing with today's technologies, which is not to meet the enemy with his rifle and bayonet against your soldier with his rifle and bayonet, but rather penetrate right into his brain in and shut down his entire command system. Now, what happened to be that Hezbollah was
Hmm.
highly centralized. And so when the headquarters was shut down, all these people all over the country that were sitting on inventories of rockets and missiles ready to launch didn't launch them. They did not launch them because they were waiting for orders.
Hmm.
But that is how you're supposed to fight these days. Now, things like drones and so on and so forth, as I say, are not new and secondary. But that is the really modern thing to do because in order to do what the Israelis did, they needed something called intelligence. They had to have really accurate intelligence. And how
Mm,
do you think they got this intelligence? They got it by using artificial intelligence
mm,
in a serious way. That is how they were able to, essentially penetrate all the different security barriers and do it. And for also, of course, the creation of the information which had reached Hezbollah as to these desirability of these, uh, these little gizmos, what are they called, the beepers,
yeah.
because uh, they were terrified that the Israelis would be able to read all their iPhones, which is a very realistic fear.
Right.
And therefore, they decided to come up with the foolproof system whereby any Hezbollah person in Beirut goes into a bar at random, picks up the phone on the counter, calls headquarters when
Mm,
he's beeped to do so. And then you blow up the beepers. So it was, uh, this is what artificial intelligence is supposed to do for you. Not to let you go there with your soldiers, your artillery, and your tanks, and you bomb with aircraft, and you do it slightly better,
mm,
but rather you do something completely different. And that's what happened. They created a whole artificial universe was created for the purposes of Hezbollah decision making. So they thought this was a good idea. And then when they realized how easy it was to do this by simulating, everything, uh, then they added on the fact that they also persuaded them to buy these new field radios, which were offered at a very low price and which happened to have explosives. So that when the beeper thing drove them to the military means of communication, field radios, they
mm,
blew up. That's
right.
why they all had to meet. So I mean, this is what artificial intelligence is supposed to do for you: is to be able to create, simulate an entire world for this thing, not to just do a single piece of deception,
Mm,
but fabricate all these things. Like, for example, fabricate communications from the Augustine Guards technology experts who commented on the supplier and said, "Oh yes, it's a very good idea," and so on and so forth. So that is what. So that will be the real modern war. That's the modern war, not the Ukraine war. But that's not because the Ukrainians are not smart or the Russians are not smart, right? But because they've been fighting a limited war, an 18th century war, with a very slow timetable and with nobody fully committed, and so on and so forth. Uh, so the
why? So,
yes,
so, this is a good point that you're making, that sort of the point of, or the new tools allow for total reconnaissance, right? You talk
right,
about, yeah, the Israel facilitating, simulating this fake world based on having deep, penetrating signals intelligence, basically, but also human intelligence
yeah.
into
The,
Hezbollah's
it was
operations.
all deep fake.
Hmm.
You see, you induce people to do certain things because you create the whole environment for them. That is what was the product on offer. You see,
Hmm. And why is it then that the Ukraine and Russia are pulling their punches?
they're not pulling the punches. It is that I have to presume that Mr. Zelensky is a greater expert on Ukrainian politics than I am,
Hmm.
and it was his decision not to mobilize the Ukrainian population as you would normally do for a struggle for national liberation. He evidently believed that many people in Ukraine were not really committed to this. That's why he did not have conscription from age 18, because it is the 18 and 19-year-olds who really you want to conscript
Hmm.
because they're the ones who, are not. people at 27. And in fact, when they tried to conscript at 27, uh, more than half of the eligible Ukrainians simply left Ukraine. You know, they moved out to nearby Poland and Germany, and as far as New Zealand passed. So um, it was a political. And now, similarly, Mr. Putin is not a dictator, as people say. A man goes to elections. He was elected. The elections may all be feudal, but it still has to have people voting for him. He can knock out competition in unfair ways and lock them up, even kill them. But then he does have elections. And
Mm.
he believes that if he sent 18, 17 and a half year old or 18-year-old, 19-year-old Russian soldiers to fight and die, that he will not be reelected. And he means to be reelected. Hence, in other words, he was not afraid necessarily of the United States, but he was afraid of Russian mothers. He was afraid of Russian mothers, so he did not use the Russian army. Every Russian regiment, battalion has a quota of conscripts. So the man fights a classic continental warfare, large spaces, armored vehicles, and so on. And the one thing he doesn't have is an army. And instead, they go around hopping around, trying to get some Buryat contract soldiers, assorted Caucasians, and so on. And eventually, of course, with Prigozhin, Wagner, which got these people straight from jail, which is a very 18th century thing to do. They used some mercenaries. It couldn't be more 18th century. But that was Putin's decision that he wants to keep ruling Russia, and uh, and he has to get elected. Once, of course, he has not behaved as a democratic leader, but was an elected leader. And he knew that if he sends young Russians to die in Ukraine, he won't get elected.
Mm.
So there was not pulling of punches. And Zelensky, on the other hand, knows that these people are not really in it. They're not. No Ukrainian who had a nice job in Silicon Valley walks out and jumps on a plane to Kiev. They just didn't, you know.
Well, I think this points to the fact that neither side believes that this is really an existential war, if the
Well,
political concerns
that
are
some
primary.
people believe that.
Mm.
Some Russians believe that Russia without Ukraine is an amputated body, given that the historic Russia started in Kiev and Rus, as it's called.
Hmm.
Our very term Russian comes from Rus, which actually Scandinavian term for a rower, right? Because these were not Slavics, but they were people who had come from the Göteborg area in Sweden.
Hmm.
Swedes, a bunch of Swedes went to start the Russian state.
Right.
And so it, uh, the, it's the theater of this war, that is to say, the lands, between the Dnieper and the Volga. Okay, these are the classic lands of continental warfare, but that's all is classic about it. Not the lack of commitment of the fight. The Russians, by choice, that is, Putin did. If there was a throbbing patriotic heart in Russia, Putin did not want it because he did not declare war, did not mobilize to limit his commitment. Whereas Zelensky, as a practiced politician, feels that half the Ukrainians don't really care for this war, and there are some complications. Western Ukraine, which is to say the area which was called Subcarpathian Ruthenia, was only added to Ukraine in 1940 by the decision, the generosity of Adolf Hitler, that shifted it from the easternmost end of Slovakia,
Hmm.
um, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, it was called. And then they took Bukovina from the Romanians. And in between, they took a slice of northeast Hungary. And this is the Western Ukraine. These are people who never, ever shared the destiny of the Russian people. They were never ruled by Russia ever. And they're not, but they're not really that committed to Ukraine either. They, so this is uh, this is why we have had an endless war, which could continue forever now, actually, if
Mm.
it doesn't get stopped by Donald Trump, to enable him to win the first of his peace prizes.
Yes.
He's going for several.
Right. Uh, how do you think this shapes up for Europe then? Do you think that this is a consequential conflict for Europe more broadly, or is this
Well,
isolated?
it's um, many. Ukraine is geographically part of Europe,
Hmm.
and to some degree, it is also culturally part of Europe. And what happened is that a nation in Europe fought for its independence, attacked by a foreign aggressor, and nobody in the rest of Europe stirred. Now, in the wars of independence that were fought by the Italians, for example, there had lots of foreign volunteers.
Hmm.
A lot of people came to help the Italians. When the Greeks, Lord Byron died in Greece,
Right.
helping the Greeks be independent.
Hmm.
You, being a European meant that you were willing to fight for the independence of fellow European states. Okay? Now, since the Germans were the aggressors in two world wars, they would not be beneficiaries of this. But everybody else, yeah, you know, um, in the Finnish War, the Winter War, 1939, 1940, it was geographically very recondite. It occurred while a world war had already started in September of 39. And so, nevertheless, there was a lot of volunteering. And why? And now what we have is a different Europe, a Europe with a demography that is doesn't it's a demography of death and not of life, because Europeans don't have children.
Hmm.
And all wars in history were fought by people who had more than one male child. Families that had to have at least two children, two male children, sorry, to have wars. And most people had three.
Hmm.
Now Europe does not have male children. So Europe's demographic destiny, the destiny of countries like Spain and Italy, is that they will disappear. There's no vitality there. There is no youthful energy. There is no idealistic drive. You know, Greece was a very remote and exotic country in 25 and so on. Um, but today, you can get many people in Western Europe can get into the cars and reach Ukraine in a few hours.
Hmm.
Nobody's coming. But why
So,
they're not coming? Because they are themselves, they are not, they have lost the capacity to fight. In fact, there are armies all over Europe. NATO, the United States makes an investment in NATO. The Europeans, of course, spend more on it. And they're spending it for things they call armies. There are people wearing uniforms, that's true, but they're not capable of fighting. They're not capable of fighting for any reason.
hmm.
If they were deployed in any combat in any place in the world for any reason, and 12 of them died, that would be the end of the intervention. The government would fall. You know, I asked the Italian defense minister Crosetto, who is from a right-wing party, right,
Hmm.
heavily involved in military matters. I say, why did you make a statement a few months ago next to the foreign minister Tajani in it, saying that under no circumstances would any Italian soldiers be sent to Ukraine? So what was that statement? Who asked you to make such a statement? They stood in front of TV cameras and declared that. And I said, are you telling me that if the Russians now start lining up Ukrainian babies and eating them one by one, the Italians will still not intervene? Is there nothing that they will fight for? Definitely not going to fight to defend their own country if they're in that situation. And Crozetta said, if I did not make that statement, my government would have fallen. In other words, the Italian parliament
Hmm.
does vote budget money for having an army. They buy their boots and the uniforms, pay them something, right? But they're not actually soldiers. And why? Because they will never be sent to fight. So this is a phenomenon that surfaced not so suddenly. I toured the Yugoslav during the Yugoslav war. I toured the national contingent, and of all the national troops that I visited, only one was ready to fight, and they were the Danes. The Danes, the only ones who actually protected Serbs. It was a Danish tank battalion with some infantry. Wherever they were stationed, no, the civilians were protected.
Hmm.
None of the others. And the ones who hit television were the Dutch, who surrendered and then nervously socialized with the Serbs and were drinking with them. They got caught. And the Dutch Republic had to disestablish that whole battalion, fire everybody, and so on. But in reality, they're not capable of war. And for a European nation state not to be able to fight the war is a negation of its very essence of European states. The whole of European energy came from the rivalry
Hmm.
of
Right.
so many different independent jurisdictions in a relatively small area. If you
Hmm.
looked at Asia and so on, these spaces were occupied by single empires,
Hmm.
which were deadening, inert empires. Whereas in Europe, there was this buzzing of rival little countries, rival full of energy, inventing all kinds of stuff. The Dutch War of Independence, they invented the modern industry, shipbuilding, and the whole dynamic energy of Europe came from war.
Hmm.
And the fact that you have a demography that makes war almost impossible, and you have a de-Bellicized culture, a culture that deplores, warlike talk and warlike speeches and warlike stances and the whole thing. One reason why the Europeans are appalled by Israel, appalled, is that Israelis leave their homes and so on, put on a uniform, get a rifle, and fight,
Hmm.
which is what defined Europe. But to Europeans today, it is so bizarre and so strange, so unbelievably strange that you would do that, and instead of simply refusing to fight and obliging your government to surrender. So this is a cultural shift, and the only confusing aspect of it, because they've been such shit, is that they still have armies and they spend a lot of money on them. Whereas in reality, there's only one army left in the whole of Europe, and that's the British Army. That's the only one. Because the British soldier, when you deploy a British soldier to wherever you deploy him, he
Hmm.
never says, "Oh, why are we doing this?" He takes the Queen's shilling, as they say. Now it's the King's shilling. He gets three square meals a day, and he has a nice uniform. But when you send him to war to ask why I'm here, that has nothing to do with being a soldier. So the British still have their army is very small, but their soldiers are real soldiers. They're not just individuals dressed as soldiers. And why this is so important, instead of being so marginal, it is that it happened to be the essential engine of European life and creativity. You fight a war, people get killed. At the end of the war, soldiers come back and they want women, and the women want warriors,
Hmm.
and then they all make children. And then a few years after the war that killed so many people, there are more people than before. And the war that destroyed so many buildings, Well, there's a huge vigor of reconstruction.
Hmm.
Reconstruction is different than construction.
Right.
People want to rebuild their houses and stuff. So, in other words, for other civilizations at other times, war could be generally described as an evil, and the less of it, the better. But not Europe. Europe existed because of these wars. Um, and removing that war machine from Europe incapacitates the whole engine. And suitably enough, they're dying out demographically. I mean,
Yeah.
look at the Spanish birth rate is like not 2.2, it's 1.7 or something.
Yeah.
So, and in the meantime, immigrants are coming in.
Right.
And
Who are not
and the
European.
only people who are responding to that
Hmm.
are, of course, the extreme right. And in countries like Spain and Italy, you don't really have an extreme right because the Crosetto gentleman I quoted is supposed to be from the extreme right,
Hmm.
but they're not. So this what's happening in Europe is that it's undergoing an Islamization. Although the only country so far that has passed a law that just did in Britain to protect the Quran from being burnt,
Hmm.
even though many books should be burnt, but the Quran first of all.
Hmm.
And they passed a law, a blasphemy law, because there have enough Pakistanis in the Labour Party, members of parliament, of course, Pakistani members of parliament for whom this is the most important issue, because that is what it is. When you have a Birmingham Muslim from Pakistan who may be involved in advanced research and all that kind of stuff, his culture, he's still tied to that village back in Punjab.
Right.
His whole culture comes from a village in Punjab, even if he has 4 degrees.
So do you
Oh,
think that,
sorry.
well, you've laid out a number of really important points, which is the demographic crisis in Europe. I spoke to someone the other day about the fertility crisis more broadly and trying to get it under control. But I hadn't drawn the connection between that and warfighting capacity. And then, of course, there's also the
No,
cultural,
no, it's not just that you need bodies to fight wars. It is that wars generated fertility.
yes, the creative
The
destruction.
aftermath of a war is the soldiers come back and women want warriors
Hmm.
and warriors want women. Okay. So if you make such a speech and then the 12 members of parliament of the Spanish parliament who are homosexual get up, well, what has this got to do with us? Yes, but you, gentlemen, have nothing to do with the future of Spain, do you?
Right.
None of you procreate.
Hmm.
And we're talking here about the future of a country.
Right.
So whatever else that you may do in your policies, financial, economic, whatever, if whatever it is else you're doing doesn't generate babies, you have no future. And if you have no future, what's the point of a lot of things that people do, which they say we will need them in the future? There is no future. There's no, I mean, a lot of investments are long-term investments.
Mhm.
There's no point in that.
Right. And so that, yeah, so the lack of creative destruction, the lack of warriors in general, you
The
talked
lack of
about,
new life.
right.
You
There's no
see, as I say,
vitality. There's no
the
vitality.
fertility crisis is a vitality crisis.
Hmm.
You don't have to wait until those children will be missing from the picture. Right now, there is a lack of vitality.
Do you think that the US withdrawing proxy support for European defense might improve the situation? I guess what I'm asking is is war necessary to keep Europe going? Do you foresee Europe either dying or effectively becoming uh, becoming stagnant as
Well,
these empires in
what
the
we
East.
have, what we look, Europe only had one period without war, and that is 1945 to the present,
Hmm.
right? And we see the consequences.
And do you think that is only enforced by U.S. hegemony, though?
No, I don't think U.S. imagine. No, I think this had to do with uh, cultural change within the European countries.
Hmm.
If the United States, if the United States had abandoned NATO and withdrawn its forces um, in uh, at some earlier time when the Soviet Union was still in business, then that made a difference. But not now. I mean, these are cultural changes have to do with um, you see, you have a computer and a it has a lot of wires and things. So you go and just pull out the wire, and then and then you can't do certain things. Maybe the whole computer will go blank. You don't know that. But that's what they did. They pulled out the wire, and that wire was the culture of war, the culture of warriors and of women who want to have babies made by warriors. That happened to be the engine of Europe.
Hmm.
That was the engine. If In 1950, my father, who was a refugee from Romania with three young children, but also a business genius, wanted to build a factory in Milano, Italy. In order to build this factory, which wasn't huge, he had to buy a piece of land to build the building because every single square foot of Milano during this post-war explosive post-war boom, you could not rent. He didn't want to build. He didn't even want to buy. He wanted to rent. He couldn't rent anything because every space there were 1,000 companies that had risen and they were making everything that was subsequently called the Italian economic miracle, right?
Hmm.
This energy was the energy of war. They just came out of a world war. Italy, of course, was defeated and didn't matter anything. People came back. They came back. And they were working everywhere and they were making children and so on. And that was the classic European thing. You have a war, and then the post war energy generated by that is that you have all these peasants, who are taken out to the villages and thrown into dramatic warlike events. And then, suddenly they didn't they didn't die, they're not invalids, they're empowered, they want to,
Yes. So that's a bleak prescription for Europe. Do you think it's reversible?
yes, it is reversible. First of all, they have to understand, and then you have to have a proper culture for that.
Hmm.
You make a response. You have to have some belief in the future. Excuse me. Hello? All right, excellent. So they're going to drive him to our house. Excellent. Thank you. I was about to go and pick up my grandson.
Ah,
And okay, so the the thing, my observations about Europe are simple, superficial, to the point of being banal and obvious. If you have no babies, you have no future. What else?
mhm,
The, to talk about, oh, we're here for the future of Italy. What
mhm.
Italy? You mean the future for northern Morocco? So in other words, the problem is very obvious. It is a matter of cultural attitudes and a matter of vitality. It's very interesting to see, um, how these things are working out. Um,
Yes.
I mean, uh, so right now they go around shouting about Gaza.
Hmm.
There are big crowds in London talking about Gaza. Many of them are Muslims, of course, and they don't think beyond the point of Muslim solidarity. If Hitler were Muslim, there'd be lots of them loving him, and of course they do, even without that.
Yeah.
But who is marching for Britain? Who is marching for Britain? It is there are people, of course, but there are people that the elite wants to marginalize. They're
Hmm.
considered weirdos. You know, it's the extreme right and all that kind of stuff. They're thrown into a in other words, the only people who even recognize the existence of a problem are people who come with a lot of baggage because they have weird things about them. But there's nothing weird about the very simple analysis that if a politician is talking about the need to invest in the future for education, for this, and for that, and there are no babies, there's no future, you know.
Right.
Um, and so uh, it's pretty simple.
Yes. So, with Europe taking a backstage seat for probably the remainder of the century, assuming they don't get this cultural change underway, which they may, um, I wanted to ask you a little bit about US power projection, and in particular, the competition between the United States and China.
Well,
So,
yeah, well, for the time being, the Chinese are not really in the projection business.
hmm,
They have enough, they have warships and all that stuff, but which they can use to make it hard to do an amphibious landing in China or something of the sort. But they're not in the business of invading. They don't have capabilities like to invade countries.
well, they do
Um,
do a lot of economic and influence, right, through Belt and Road and
oh
trying to
yes, but
trying to secure port
economic
access.
influence is exists in a different dimension.
Hmm.
Economic influence is you cannot the war the a navy and an investment capacity are not the same thing.
Hmm.
Geoeconomic. I invented this term geoeconomics. You know, according to Wikipedia, which is the logic of war with the means of commerce. So, for example, you conquer an industry by out investing everybody else
Hmm.
so that you're able to produce those widgets cheaper because you have bigger scale or something. The Chinese are great at business, and they are. Um, the Chinese have never, ever won in a geopolitical contest. The Chinese running into a war, they were defeated. And after being defeated, they were ruled by whoever defeated them for 200 or 300 years, like the last Qing dynasty, who were Chinese nationalist historians say, oh, they're all Chinese or something. They were not Chinese. They spoke the Yurchen language all the way through to 1912, and they would not marry outside the clan and so. Um, so, and the Chinese are not warriors. The Chinese are business people. They can buy and they can invest and they can seduce, but they can't fight. Um, in their fighting, they they I mean, we saw that in the war in 1979. China invaded Vietnam to stop the Vietnamese from eating up the Khmer Rouge.
Hmm.
So there was a big Chinese force goes on the Vietnam border, and skirmishing, and then there is some fighting, and then eventually the Chinese stop and go home. In the meantime, the Vietnamese field army continues to operate in Cambodia. They never call it back to defend the border. They defend the border with their part-time home guards.
Hmm.
And why is that? Because they're Chinese. You know, they took casualties,
Hmm.
people died and so on, and after a while the Chinese gave up and walked away. Now, when a great power attacks a little power, sometimes the little power, does pretty well against them. But a great power keeps at it because they can't afford to be defeated, especially not by little power. The Chinese didn't keep at it. Why? Because they took 30,000 dead.
Mm.
In the Indian border class ship 2020 on the Galwan River, 4 Chinese died. And they went into 8 months of silence while they were preparing the presentation of 4 deaths. They had to, they did all kinds of things. They moved them, they rehoused them, they promoted their wives. 8 months to tell the Chinese people that 4 soldiers had died. So, whatever crisis Europeans are suffering, the Chinese are there and past them. And yet, they want to be a great power. So, the trick is that they can do it. For example, they can fight Taiwan because the Taiwanese are also Chinese.
Hmm.
The Taiwanese are incapable of being serious about self-defense. They have a large, a very rich economy and 23 million people, right? Which is just shy of 3 times the population of Israel.
Hmm.
If Israel had 3 times its population and 4 times the GDP, they wouldn't be bothering about Gaza. They'd be mopping up in Casablanca and so
Hmm.
on. And the Taiwanese, on the other hand, await passively to be protected. So the Taiwanese are like Europeans, except more so. And the Chinese are going that way. Chinese also have no babies.
Yes. I was going to ask about that. So what I'm hearing from you then is that, resisting Chinese influence is really just a matter of the United States in particular standing up for itself and its allies.
Well, there's a question of corruption.
Hmm.
Uh, the American Trump, just his latest crime of Trump is that he wants to revoke the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act
Mm.
uh, on the grounds that no U.S. company can win anything if a Chinese company is there because the U.S. company can't bribe anybody, which is true possibly in the majority of world markets. Everybody, of course, is horrified by such a dastardly and immoral proposal. But the fact is that, that's how the Chinese operate.
Hmm.
But there is, apart from elemental fighting issues, there is a question of understanding the outside world. And they don't, of course. They are the most provincial people, the most provincial culture. When they went to Sri Lanka and gave them a lot of money, they thought that they could be purchasing Sri Lanka's undying loyalty.
Hmm.
And they were very, very shocked when Sri Lankans were not, uh, you know, uh, the, the Chinese Americans regard corruption, they think of the meaning of flesh breaking down as a horrible thing. And Chinese think that it is a way of coexisting. So giving bribes doesn't make them feel bad. When a Chinese gives a bribe, it doesn't feel it's a criminal.
Mm.
It's just giving money to people. What's wrong with that? Uh, However, they are incapable of operating successfully, and I can give you a long list, but Sri Lanka will do for all. The the Chinese arrived, they invested a lot of money, they built a gigantic port facility, which is very useful actually. Um, and then they expected gratitude. They hadn't read colonial history. You know,
Mm.
your Frenchmen left the boulevards of Paris to go to places which like now called Burkina Faso. Okay. You go from Paris to Burkina Faso, and they built roads and schools and so on, and established law and order, and introduced literacy. And so you would expect that people in Burkina Faso would compete to be able to go to France in order to, to cut the grass for Frenchmen, shine their boots in gratitude. Because when the French didn't arrive, there were parts of Africa where there were neither British nor French.
Mm,
And those are the parts which are totally, totally ruined. I mean, so uh, there's an, I think that the Chinese are, the problem with the Chinese is that they do have a way of living. And that is to say, Mao was a very cruel person. He was a really terrible person, and he killed tens of millions of people, as you know, through his various schemes. Um, but normally, the Chinese could not have been so self-destructive because otherwise the population of China would be 4 million instead of being 2 billion.
mm,
So, uh, so they know how to live and coexist and so on and so forth. But warfare is not for them. The idea that they're going to fight the Marine Corps, that's not for them.
mhm,
There might be a clash. And we saw that in Korea. In Korea, the only Chinese who really fought, and there were quite a few of them, there were not like two of them, are the ones who rushed up the Marines, defying their bullets. It was only later we discovered why. Is they were all Kuomintang troops, which had been captured by the communists,
mm,
and whose families were going to starve because they were black families. If your son was in a Kuomintang, it was a black family. So when they shared out the landlord land, you got nothing, and you're going to starve.
mm,
But if your son volunteered and went to Korea and got himself killed, the moment he got himself killed, the whole family became a rat.
mm,
So that's why they were fighting. They were fighting for their families. But to fight for something called China, forget it.
mm,
That's why all manner of foreign nomads would show up and defeat them. 3 nomads on horseback would defeat Chinese army.
mm. And so, is the U.S. really the last great fighting force left?
Well, no, I mean, I'm sure there are potentially others. I think if the Russians invaded Finland, they would get a national response.
Mm,
That all the Finns who were called up would rush to service, and the ones who were not called up would demand. They would go to barracks and demand their old rifles and so on.
mm,
So I think that there are, and they're not the only ones. As I
yes.
told you all those years ago, I saw 26 national contingents out of pure cowardice, not protecting the various Bosnians they were supposed to protect and so on. And the Danes did,
Mm,
absolutely. And then I saw the Danes again uh, in Afghanistan. I toured all the different national. There was a time when Afghanistan was full of different units contributed by different countries, and I went to the Danish position, which was quite a remote area, and they all complained that nothing was happening.
mm,
And the reason nothing was happening was because this was a new battalion which just arrived from Denmark. And the previous battalion had massacred Afghans. The Taliban would go up to other national these encampments, they were like bases. They would go up
mm,
to the base of these other countries, and they would lob some mortar rounds and start sniping and so on, and there'd be some response and all. Well, when they did that with the Danes were didn't stay in their position. They
mm,
crawled out, and got up to the Taliban who were shooting at them and stabbed them with their service knives so that their comrades wouldn't hear the shot
mm,
and do things of that sort. And in the Yugoslav Civil War, I saw the Danes service would open fire with rifles. They would reply with the coaxial machine gun of the tank. If they used machine guns, they would use the tank gun.
mm,
All the other national contingents, before firing a bullet, they connected with Bonnie, this Ghanaian crook who was in charge of peacekeeping, who had a son who was in the smuggling business. I forget. Um, I don't know, Kofi Annan, what's his name? Kofi
Mm,
Annan. They would contact Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan would say, well, we'll deliberate, we will let you know, and so on. And then they would check with their own defense minister, and the defense minister would say, well, but just don't kill too many because, da, da, da. The Danes were sent to there and told, you are in place, you know what's going on. We know nothing in Copenhagen. So if you feel you're a commanding officer, fire when you feel you should fire. That's it. Don't call us up
mhm.
because we don't have the information you have. You're right there. You feel, so, and they were not, of course, the only ones, but they were. It was a very dramatic difference
Yes.
um, uh, on it. So there are populations in Europe that have retained this. For example, let's say Norway were to come under attack. Norway shares a border with Russia.
Mhm.
Norway is in NATO, of course, but they could theoretically. I know every Norwegian would rush to. So there's uh, you don't really have to jump into the business of evaluating entire nations in such a facile while. It's simply the countries that have retained or reintroduced military service.
Mm,
When the Russians took Crimea, the Swedes, who had only stopped a few years before, immediately reactivated military service. It took some time for them to actually build up, and so they had to get sergeants before they could get a lot of enlisted men. The countries that have military service
mhm.
still have a sense of nationhood because embodied in the people who leave their homes and go to these places and put on a uniform. Countries with national service have a future. Countries that don't. I
Wow.
mean, one of the things about these Israelis, I've been there a few times, of course, since the war started because I'm a military contractor and so on.
Mm,
And Israel is a country where a woman with a degree who is a doctor will have 3 children,
right.
you know. And so when there's a war and people get killed, then it's not like every death is the end of a whole family.
Yeah, they're the only modernized nation that has a above replacement fertility at the moment.
Is that
Uh,
so?
yeah, that's according to someone studying fertility and demographics I spoke to
Yeah.
the other day.
I'm just going to take a look. Oh, what happened? Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, so I can't see you. Oh, yes, now I can. No, I just wanted to look up about the Finns. What's their birth rate?
Oh,
Uh, the Finnish birth rate, fertility rate. Sorry,
yeah, TFR 1.26.
right, 1.26.
Hmm.
Okay, you may think that's not very high, but by the standards of Spain, it's explosive. 1.26
Yeah, still not enough to
per female.
replace. Yeah.
You need 2.2, and they are two, you said 2.26. What was the
Uh,
number you quoted
no,
me?
the Finns are 1.26.
Okay, so they're also the superior.
Yes.
So this will not last long. This could be the last generation of people called Finns.
Yeah, perhaps, perhaps.
Yeah.
So, given that that's the situation, it sounds to me like Europe either needs to get its act together. They need to get their demographics back on track. They need to get a culture of national pride back in order, and they probably also need to get real war fighting underway in some sense. Part of the problem is sort of like the curse of peace, right? The fact that all of Europe, except for the Ukraine, is at peace with the others means that it's very there's very little reason for them to uh
Well, I mean,
to do national
the,
service.
the, in the past, the Ukraine war would have been sufficient to for all of them to participate.
It's going to be simpler.
The gentlemen would not stay abed in Berlin
And it's red.
when there were Ukrainians who were defending the freedom from Russians.
Yes.
They would go there. You know.
Bring it to my.
Still, anyway. Listen, I have to go because I have an important business meeting coming up
Certainly.
with my grandson.
Yes.
And what's more important business than that?
Exactly.
But anyway, I hope this is useful and send me if you make anything of it. Okay?
Yes. Thank you for your time, Mr. Luttwak.
Not at all. Pleasure. Thank you.